So Yumna and Dave asked me to say a few words, and kind of thinking about what I should say, I really started thinking about what we try and do as universities. And it kind of occurred to me that, you know, in the past, universities primarily did one thing. They taught. You know, it's all about instilling knowledge, transferring knowledge from teacher to student. These days, I think there are 5 key things that we try and do as universities. Obviously, we teach. Over the centuries, universities have done much more in terms of research. We then have what used to be actually called the third mission, but today we normally refer to that as I&E, innovation and engagement. And then there are 2 really important sort of newer ones. One is health and well-being for all of us and our staff and students, particularly I think these days mental health, as we work in a very stressed environment. But then the 5th one, which is really what this meeting today is all about, is a core part now of universities, of our university's mission, is ensuring equality and respect for all. And of course, that's what we're going to hear about today. In engineering, on that particular agenda, our focus primarily over the last years has been on equality related to gender. And of course, the whole programs around Athena SWAN. That's been fantastically successful. Last year, the college got awarded the Athena SWAN Silver Award. And it's been brilliant to see that. And I think really the thing I wanted to point out and what I feel about that is in doing that work around gender equality, really the big change is seeing that change from being something that was a special project, something we do as a specific thing, to being something that's just part of the fabric of the college. It's embedded so much that we don't think of, oh, a special person to represent women or whatever. It's just part of everything we do, and at all times in our structures, in our organization, it's sort of part and parcel of who we are to ensure that we have that equality in terms of gender. In terms of looking at race and what we're trying to do in the B.A.M.E network, that's a much newer thing for us as a college, but as head of college, I wanted to sort of be clear, we are as committed to that equally as we were to in promoting equality of gender. We need to make race issues and respect and equality in that area as much as part and parcel of everything we do, as we have been for looking at Athena SWAN and male-female equality. Of course, I'm talking about gender and race as 2 separate things, but of course what today's talk I think is all about is, of course, we're all multifaceted people, and so we are multiple things, so it's not really very correct to sort of separate out these things as if they were standalone separated issues. And so it's going to be really good to hear today about intersectionality and how these things cross over. So let me finish with that and just finish by reiterating in my final sentence. In defining those 5 areas of what universities do, they are all very, very important. And so equality and respect, as I've said, isn't just an additional thing we do. It must be core and central to everything we do as a college, and we're committed to ensuring that that is the case. Okay, so that's all from me. Let me hand over. I think, Dave, are you going to say a few words next? I can't remember the agenda.
Only really just to say thanks you for the introduction, and to welcome Naveena on to do her talk. So I'll hand over to you, Naveena. You can share your screen, and best luck.
Thank you. Okay, so I should be able to see my screen now. Okay. So hi everyone, I'm Naveena Prakasam, and this talk is titled Race, Intersectionality and Gender, Working Towards Developing Anti-Racist Practices. So I'm just going to go over the structure of this session. I'll begin by talking to you very briefly about myself in terms of what I do in Swansea University and my areas of research interest and research focus. I then go on to talk about the purpose of this talk. So why should we be working towards developing anti-racist practices? And then I go on to discuss what institutional racism is and what that means for HE. Before then discussing what intersectionality, why intersectionality, and why is that important for the higher education context. And then, of course, I also will be talking about disciplinary differences because I'm a social scientist and I'm talking to many engineers in the audience amongst people, amongst others who are in different disciplines. So I will be discussing disciplinary differences as well. And then I move on to discussing what anti-racist practices might look like. And I'll be sharing my own experience of diversifying reading lists briefly. And then I end with a question, which is, are EDI initiatives the way forward, which basically stands for equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. So that's the structure of this session. So about me then, I'm a lecturer in human resource management and leadership at the Center for People and Organization at SWAN. And my broad areas of research interests include leadership studies, which is what I did my PhD in, and also race intersectionality, as well as digital media. And I'd like to say why, and sort of talk to you a little bit about why I started looking into race and intersectionality. So this sort of started for me in 2016. At the time I was living in America, and I started working on a paper which was about the experiences of foreign workers. So as a foreign worker, that's what made me sort of look into the experiences of individuals, such as foreign workers, and then that made me look into sort of race and intersectionality. So my collaborator Natasha and I started looking into all of this, and that's where my sort of journey began of looking into these concepts. And then I'm involved with Athena SWAN. I'm the academic co-chair for the self-assessment team at the School of Management, and it was my interest in the areas of race and intersectionality which drew me to Athena SWAN. And I'm also an academic integrity officer at SWAN. So that's sort of what I do at Swansea University. Right, so what is the purpose of this talk then? So what are we talking about here? So I just wanted to say at the very start that this talk isn't about offering solutions, but perhaps asking more questions. So I'd love to sort of have a discussion at the end and have a dialogue and you know, maybe to discuss this a bit more. So it's not about offering solutions. And then to look at why is there a need to actively work towards anti-racist practices in HE? So I'll be looking at some data and some figures and research in the areas of race and intersectionality in order to sort of examine this. And then, as I said earlier, you know, examine what might anti-racist practices really look like. Does anyone recognize this image? And yeah, so yes. So I've got a yes from Alison Braddock. Okay, so this is basically, you know, the Goldsmiths Anti-Racist Action Group. What they'd done, a group of students had occupied a grade 2 listed building for 137 days in order to protest institutional racism. And they had a list of 12 demands. One of the demands actually included, you know, mandatory, you know, diversity training for all staff. So that's what this image is from. And this was in the news quite a lot as well. But then what is institutional racism? That's the question. Let's look at this a little bit further. So first of all, there's various definitions of institutional racism. I'm going to go with the one by Shivanandan. So this definition, I'm going to read this out. It says institutional racism is that which covertly or overtly resides in the policies, procedures, operations, and culture of public or private institutions, reinforcing individual prejudices and being reinforced by them in return. So the reason why I've got policies, procedures, operations, and culture in bold is because it's something that seems to sort of exist in processes and even structures. I know structure isn't the word that's in this definition, but But the idea is it's almost hidden in the policies and procedures. So why discuss institutional racism then? Because it's less visible and almost hidden. And that's why I wanted to sort of begin by discussing institutional racism, particularly in the HE context, before I moved on to intersectionality. So let's look at the higher education context then. So this is from Katie Shan's conversation piece. So she's written a book about her research of interviewing, loads of staff in the academy and their experiences of being in the academy. So it's quite interesting to see what the participants have talked about. So when she talked to these participants, one of the things that came up was that it is subtle, and obviously in a university environment, we all want to think of this as a post-racial space. We want to believe that we are over the problem of race and everything's all lovely, and that's what she sort of refers to as liberal racism in that particular book, as well as in the article, where it's about these, and to quote her, she says, she refers to this as a smiling face racism, where it is really subtle. And again, some of the participants in our study describe it as being insidious in the academy, which is this idea that it's really slow, but then it has really harmful effects. And then there's also this other experience, which I found really interesting, and I thought it would be useful for this talk, which is to do with teaching. So one of the participants in that research talks about how teaching can be challenging for non-white academics, especially when they're trying to perhaps diversify the reading list or decolonize the curriculum. And in that particular example, she refers to a participant who talks about a particularly aggressive student that that's got some extremist sort of ideologies, and the staff feeling really uncomfortable. So the point here is it's quite challenging for staff, especially for non-white academics, to do these things. So then what might the implications be for disciplinary differences? So I discussed this because, again, I'm a social scientist, and I understand that most of you in the audience are in engineering. So I'd like to talk about this particular book that I'm reading at the moment. It's called More Examples, Less Theory. And it's about historical studies of writing psychology. So what Michael Billig does is he's quite critical about writing in the social sciences. But then why am I talking about psychology? So why is that relevant? That's because he talks about writing in experimental psychology, where he says how the way of writing almost sort of dehumanizes the subjects. So the question is, so why is this relevant? Perhaps because in STEM subjects like engineering, accessible writing and decolonizing the curriculum may mean something completely different. So how you diversify reading lists and decolonize the curriculum in the social sciences would be different. But it did make me wonder about engineering then. So it'll be great to have a chat about this after the presentation. So just something to think about. So because we just looked at the book, More Examples, Less Theory, I wanted to share an example of lived experience of an academic in the social sciences. So I'm going to share an excerpt from Elena Liu's paper, where she talks about navigating the academy as an early career academic. And Elena Liu is a critical race theorist, and she does leadership research, someone I've referenced quite a bit because my own PhD thesis was focused on authentic leadership. So in this paper, she talks about sort of her experience. And Nigel here is the new research director that's joined the center that she works at. So I'm going to read this out. Nigel charges me with a theme for the Leadership Matters newsletter to produce gender and leadership. And I challenge him in a reply email. Do you think if I present the newsletter on gender, I risk marginalizing myself from the center as the other, I'm concerned the subtext of our institute will say ethnic woman looks at trivial personal issues of gender while white male academics do the real work of leadership. Maybe one of my research areas on leadership ethics or philanthropy would suit for an alternate newsletter topic. I'm just going to stop for 2 seconds if you want to read this. Okay, so, and I'm sure you want to know what the response was. And again, this is from Elena's paper. So that's the response that she got from the new research director that joined the center. Says, good questions, such clever thinking. Nigel responds as though he's patting me on the head. Gender and leadership, please, he presses more firmly. Okay, so what does this really mean, and why am I sharing this example? So the reason why I share this example is because this illustrates the complexity of doing this type of research, even in the management and organizational literature or in the social sciences, where one almost becomes a subject of the power dynamics. So it's really complex, and it's quite challenging then to do research on these subjects, especially if you are a woman of color, like Elena articulates. So let's talk a bit more about institutional racism. So as I said earlier, it is less visible, almost hidden, and embedded in processes and structures. And in this context, I'd like to discuss a paper by Victor Ray, which is titled A Theory of Racialized Organizations. Now, I won't go into too much detail about the theoretical frameworks, but what's interesting here is that he distinguishes between the institutional, organizational, and the individual level empirical analyses of race and ethnicity and how that's studied. And he argues and talks about how the institutional level and the organizational level is often conflated by race scholars. So then, again, why is this relevant? Because it's quite interesting to look at that distinction and then perhaps think about what the difference is between institutional, organizational, and individual levels of racism and an analysis. And why is this then relevant for HE? So I'd like to give examples here. So if you look at institutional level, and I'll come to the statistic, come back to the statistic soon, there's only 25 female Black professors in the academy in the UK. So that's an example of, say, the institutional level analysis of racism. And if you look at the organizational level, it relates to individual workplaces and wage differentials within individual workplaces. And then, of course, you've got individual level, which is in-group favoritism, and that's where there's that comic from the inclusionsolution.me, which I think is a really good example of this, which talks about someone else getting promoted after a week when someone is been there for much longer. Okay? And that takes me to the next slide, which is, are women then disproportionately affected by institutional racism? So that's when we look at intersectionality. So we've looked at institutional racism, and the question is, are women then disproportionately affected? So let's look at this in more detail. So why look at gender and race? And so this is an article which talks about how Black and minority ethnic academics are less likely to be professors and earn less than white colleagues. And that's what the analysis finds. But I've got a more engineering specific example. And thanks to Gabrielle from engineering, actually. And I think this is really useful in discussing, it's really useful to discuss this example given the context of engineering. So here, you're probably all aware of this, of designs which were sort of made keeping in mind the average white male. And in that example, you can see that there's crash test dummies. And I know that's changed now, but that is an example of how that's not the most inclusive design. And there I'd like to ask you to look at Gabrielle's paper as well, which is, can we address the diversity problem in engineering education through criticality? Bringing this back to social sciences, it made me think about phallogocentrism. So again, this idea where the masculine or the male is then the reference point in sort of the construction of meaning and as well as the use of language, which again reinforces male dominance. So there's that engineering example in terms of design, but that's also the case in how you think of social constructs or concepts. And for example, leadership. I teach leadership, and that's again a subject which is very much dominated by this white male-centric conceptualizations of it. So then moving on to intersectionality a bit more. So what intersectionality and why intersectionality, and why is this important for HE? So the term comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, and she came up with this term because she was trying to sort of discuss and address the marginalization of Black women. And her goal was to actually look at how, as you said earlier on, that how racism and sexism aren't sort of, shouldn't always be viewed separately, but then to look at how they intersect in order to create differing experiences for Black women. So it's about not looking at racialized and gendered experiences separately. And that's where this comes from. It comes from Black feminism. But let's look at the context of HE in UK. So as I mentioned earlier in one of my earlier slides, there are only 25 women Black professors in the UK and 90 men Black professors. And the data from the Equality in Higher Education Statistical Report 2018 says out of 4,735 female professors, more than 4,000 are white. So that's the HE context. And I guess that's why we are having these conversations about intersectionality and institutional racism. And that again illustrates intersectionality as well as identity politics. So even in the organization and management literature, and this is a paper from 2016, Breskel argues that there is a gap in the literature regarding intersections and more needs to be done. And that's still the case if you look at papers from 2020. In fact, I've got I will be referring to a chapter from 2020, and there's still a gap in terms of researching intersectionality in these contexts. And what you see on the right, the discussions about intersectionality and Black feminism, what's interesting is that you kind of see those types of discussions in online communities. So in the research that we did on Reddit, we found that affordances of such platforms also shape such discussions. So it's really interesting to sort of see the rise of certain types of ideologies and discussions in these platforms. Let's move on to disciplinary differences then, and the implications for engineering. So I'd like to sort of talk about how engineers and social scientists perhaps see the world through a different lens. We might also see race differently, and race as a concept and how race is studied is also been evolving, and it's changed over the last few years. So race used to be seen as an identifier versus there's race as a social construct. And in that sort of context, I'd like to talk about the chapter by Greed, Harry, Horn, and Tenari. So they discuss the changes in conceptualizations of race, and they're quite critical of how this is being approached in the management literature. Again, this comes back to that point about institutional racism, where race is seen as a problem that affects particular individuals, and organizational processes are often not seen to be the problem. Okay, so it's again, it's coming back to this point about it being hidden, embedded in structures and processes. And there's still that gap. And, you know, this is from a chapter in 2020. So moving on to then what anti-racist practices might look like. So what do we do about it? I'd like to share my experience of how I tried to diversify the curriculum, the reading list for a module called leadership. So that's what I teach to level 6 undergraduate students. And this year I actively tried to include diverse perspectives, which are non-Western centered perspectives, because leadership as a construct is seen as, you know, masculine, Western centered, and those are the sort of conceptualizations that have dominated the literature. And I'd just like to share one sort of example from my slides. So this was from the lecture titled Ethical and Authentic Leadership. So when I was discussing ethical leadership, I wanted to look at non-Anglophone perspectives of ethics. Of course, I won't go into too much detail about what the concept is, but the idea is, you know, ethical leadership and conceptualizations of ethics have also been dominated by Western-centered notions and Western-centered perspectives of ethics. So it's not just about including perhaps diverse scholars in your reading list, but also perhaps looking at alternative, non-traditional or different perspectives. So this looks at the concept of gongqi, which is, you know, a Chinese traditional concept and in understanding ethics. So this is something that I covered in my lecture. And here I'd like to mention the Diversifying Reading List Guide, which is available to all staff to access. This is developed by Rheoli Adnoddau, whose chapter I just referenced in the previous slide. And this talks about why diversifying matters to all our staff and students. And I found this really useful, and that's what I used in order to try and diversify my reading list. So finally then, in the last slide, I'd like to end with a question, which is, are EDI initiatives the way forward? There's some great work happening in Swansea University, so that's really exciting to see. There's the How Inclusive Are You, you know, campaign, which is fascinating, and there's so much being done. And of course, with the B.A.M.E network in engineering and everything that Yumna's done. So there's a lot that's happening and a lot that's positive. But I'd also like to look at some of the research that's come about. So there's several studies that have been critical of EDI initiatives, such as Athena SWAN. And there's a couple of papers in Gender Work Organization. There's Darren Ibrahim and Zanaku and Pierce, who critique such initiatives, because they argue that perhaps in kind of organizing such initiatives, are they perpetuating further inequalities? So it's quite complex. And to quote, it says, the paper by Zanaku and Pierce says, Athena SWAN is a product of neoliberalization within the UK's academic environments, reflecting the tendency towards accountability, metrics, and the performative doing of equality work within this context. So it's not as straightforward. So when we take that badge culture approach to perhaps engage with such initiatives, are we doing more harm than good? So I guess, yeah, I'd like to end with that particular question. And yeah, and those are the references, and I'd love to hear any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naveena. Very, very interesting talk. We have some questions from the chat thing. One that came up was, is this now being talked about as unconscious bias? That was from Jan.
Okay. Right. So that's so the example that I shared is perhaps an example of unconscious bias. But in terms of the conversations that are happening in the university overall, I I don't know if the term in-group is being used, but yes, that can be seen as an example of unconscious bias.
Thank you. I mean, the last point about ED&I strategies, that's something that's being pushed by research councils and various funding things. Yeah. So, and we all have to think about it when putting grants in now. And as you say, it is very metrics driven. You're recording where you are, where you want to get to, and how you get to it. Have you got any advice for people who are trying to make a difference but don't want to fall in that trap of just almost becoming box ticking? I know this is something you and I have talked about.
Yeah. I guess that's why it's a question, isn't it? Because I am involved with Athena SWAN myself, and there's a great team of people doing amazing work, but it's reconciling kind of, ticking that box with really sort of anti-racist aims and if you really want to be inclusive and not just tick those boxes. So how do we kind of balance the two together? So I think that's why it's a question. I mean, I don't know, it is, and it is complicated.
Just kind of like a comment, not really coming from somebody who thinks much more of a personal experiences and not an academic who study these things. My take on that is that if we look at diversity at the level and the point of view of an organization, it will be prone to lead to that type of tokenism and tick box exercise. But if we actually bring it to an individual level, really looking at it as a personal level and holistic, where people take the time to, as an institution, we give the space and actually encourage people to take the time to reflect about this type of subject, just to become much more aware of other people's experiences and much more, let's say, aware of our society and those differences, then I believe that will lead to a change that is much more encouraging the system than when it's just the rules or the achieving a certain target. So that's my take on it, and I guess somebody else can say what they think about that, but yeah.
Now we have a question from Alison, who's asked, what role might organisational values play in addressing inequality?
Sorry, Dave, could you repeat that question, please?
The question from Alison Braddock, what role might organisational values play in addressing inequality?
I think they might play a really big role in addressing inequality. But again, there's, I think, multiple perspectives on that, because there are some, critical management scholars who would look at the idea of values and organizational values itself quite critically, because they would say then that's interfering with individual subjectivities and try, this idea of trying to impose certain values on individuals. But I think that may be quite useful, and if it's being developed in discussion with everyone in the organizations, and yeah.
This is not a question, but just kind of for myself, are you aware of anything that is being done by other organization or structure to actually looking at that specificity of gender and race at the same time? If there is any initiative that we can look at and best practices out there?
Right.
I'm done.
Oh, okay. No, I think that there are certain, I mean, I have come across values in certain other institutions where I think inclusive and community are values, and they try and kind of ensure that all of their processes match those values. So I think there are examples of such organizations out there. But in terms of impact and whether that has led to truly achieving those anti-racist or inclusive aims, yeah, I'm not sure. I've not got the data for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you able to see the chat, Naveena, and the questions?
Sure. Yeah.
There's another question from Alison, which is about what role leaders could play in cultural change, and what mitigates against racism and other forms of discrimination. And then there's another comment there looking at saying we should be looking at all inclusive practices using strength-based approach.
Okay, so I'll answer the one about leadership. Okay, so in terms of in the leadership literature, and I'm going to answer this based on the literature I'm familiar with. I mean, culture change again is seen quite differently from varied perspectives. So, you know, Shine, who's a scholar that looks at culture change, would say that one way of facilitating an effective culture change would be perhaps to work on artifacts, you know, the visible artifacts that you see in organization, and how this is a really slow process. And of course, leadership does play an important role, but it's not just leadership, but it's a relationship between leadership, the conducive, the type of context, the conducive environment that you're in, as well as followership. So I would say it's kind of a complex interaction between various components, and one perhaps interacts with all of the other components. So purely looking at just leadership would kind of perhaps overemphasize, you know, the power that leadership can have, but it really depends on what you mean by leadership. So is it structures, or is it individual leaders? Because it's definitely something to do with structures and processes that I think we, you know, in my opinion, we need to be looking at, and not just individual leaders. So it's really complex, and it's like a multifaceted thing.
Absolutely, it's all entwined. A question from Natalie.
That's really good, yeah.
Interested in your views on quotas and unconscious bias training.
Okay, so unconscious, okay, so I'll talk about unconscious bias training. There is a lot of literature out there which is quite critical of the unconscious bias training. So some literature says that it apparently doesn't work, and it might have worse effects, but at the same time, there's also a case for this that's been made. Quotas, now, in the UK context, it's, you know, positive discrimination is not legal, but positive action is legal. So at the equality team have been working on positive action statements. So in terms of my views on quotas, I think in terms of the UK context, I think it's interesting. I mean, I know there have been calls by certain union leaders asking for positive discrimination, but I'm not sure if that's actually the way forward. Again, it's complicated, because I know in the US context it works completely differently, and you have you know, positive action there means something completely different. That there's again pros and cons for this. I mean, studies have again shown some difficulties with quotas. So, thank you.
I guess that's a difficult one. There is a question here from Esther, who is asking, it will be interesting to know the intersectionality within the statistic regarding how many of those women are international B.A.M.E, not British B.A.M.E. So that's a really, really relevant question. So do you have any comment on that?
Okay, I don't know, but there is, you're right, that's actually really interesting, because I think foreign workers' experiences of being foreign nationals is like, it's different to, you know, they may have differing experiences to those who are British ethnic minority individuals. So that's actually a really good question. And there are some papers that talk about this additional status, and I can send that through to you now if you're interested. There's a paper by Honig that talks about supplementarity, and yeah, so foreign workers' experiences, it is different, and the statistics are there, but I don't have the data with me right now. But yeah, that's a really interesting point.
I think you have more question coming down here.
Natalie's asked another question about what you think, in your experience, is one of the biggest barriers to overcome, or equally, are there some things that we can that we can help with straight away, or easier to begin than others?
Okay, so in terms of initiative, I think in terms of our role, like having those conversations with students, I think would be really helpful. I think that's a great start in terms of initiative, and thinking about diversifying reading lists. I think these are things that would be really helpful in having, and you know, I know these are challenging things to do. It's not often easy to discuss these ideas, but in terms of learning and teaching, that's one example. And yeah, and that's something that I've tried to do in the last year for my module. And again, I still have a really long way to go. I feel like I've just sort of started this journey and there's so much to do. But in terms of learning and teaching, I think diversifying the curriculum and diversifying reading lists is key. And it's not an easy conversation to have, and it's not easy to kind of to ask other people to do it. It's, again, there's the issue of you can't tell people what to teach or what to include. So having conversations and having dialogues with individuals about that. And in terms of research, I think, again, having more discussions and seminars about difficult topics or sensitive topics such as race would be really helpful, because I think I still find that this is a really difficult topic to discuss, and even, you know, even in social science disciplines, it's a difficult conversation. And I'm not just referring to the context of Swansea University, but I just mean the academy in general. When I go to conferences, it's a really sensitive and difficult topic. So I think more conversations and dialogue and research and L&D.
In engineering, it's a bit more challenging, isn't it? As a comment from Natalie as well, because we teach, you know, it'll be thermodynamics or it'll be metallic coatings and corrosion or whatever. So the literature is very matter of fact, and rather than different approaches. So how do you sort of get more of these discussions into an engineering context where that isn't the topic of your lectures?
I guess a comment I can make, I remember going to an event about not specifically looking at diversifying curriculum, but as a scientist, I had pretty much the very same question, Dave. And it's like, we teach science, how can we diversify our curriculum? And the people that were there were much more advanced than me, and they really bugged my mind, because I think one of them was really speaking, you know, the way we design things as engineer, actually taking in account, you know, the different either physiology or the difference in the people that we design things is actually important. One of the lady that was there was speaking about, she was testing a new technology that I think it was kind of some form of watch that when you put it in contact with your skin, it gets you to give you some couple of information, you know. And somehow it did work in all of the students, but not her and another one of her students, which were dark skinned. And so in engineering, we have space for this conversation, but it's just, we really kind of have to go look for it. And I think it's really, it becomes even more important when we are designing, because I think there was a research that was speaking about, I think, for example, the space between headset, between the gap between simply men and women actually is different. So all of these different things actually affect and should inform the way we design. And another one, I think Gabby will be a really good person to hear about her opinion in this, is a lot to do with especially all the new things like artificial intelligence. We as engineers, the information that we're putting into those softwares, if there is a bias into the information that we're putting, the result that will be given by the artificial intelligence machine will actually be biased. And that was proven in the US in many extent, in many of their research, that actually, especially I think it was regarding to health, that the system that were actually designed were actually discriminating towards a specific demographic. So there is all of those things that we could explore and just kind of like, you know, get us to reflect as engineers and as designers. So it's slightly more challenging, but it's just kind of a different view on it, and there is still space to actually be able to do that.
thanks, Jim. That's a really good point around designing. That's exactly where the conversation can come in. That's a very good point, because things are, as you say, designed for a particular demographic. So that is a very, very good point or very big point of entry for the conversation, I think.
There's another comment here. I'm trying to see it. There was I missed it. Somebody, I don't know if it was a question or more comment. HE can use the structure to guide anti-racism behavior. What do you think about that? How, I guess, you know, how could we implement this the anti-racist practice into the processes that exist within higher education?
I think again, of course, you've just touched on decolonizing curriculum and you've talked about design, but in terms of the processes and structures, I guess having those conversations with senior management, and perhaps if that can be part of a strategy where we're all actively trying to be inclusive and come up with an anti-racist strategy. But at the same time, I guess the danger is that it's not something that can be, and again, this is my opinion, and again, I don't think there's any straightforward solutions, but I feel like there's a danger in that it's not something that can be forced, but it kind of comes through dialogue and conversations and more, you know, open discussions with the senior management team. And but yeah, I think but I am like optimistic. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, great work happening and you know, lots of great individuals working on some fantastic initiatives. But of course, more needs to be done, and that's a problem with the academy as a whole. That's not, you know, just about particular institutions. You know, the figures speak for themselves if you look at higher education in the UK as a whole. So I guess more conversations and more transparent discussions, because again, race is something that's really difficult to talk about. And I think it's, in my experience, I mean, being, you know, female and an ethnic minority, I feel it's a lot easier talking about gender than it is about race. And I'm happy to see that that's changing slowly. So.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I think we very much. I think that's one of the things that was addressed by our first speaker, Professor Ogbonna, when he was speaking, that we are slowly. Gender is something that we are much more comfortable, and that, you know, the challenging is race is just. In his words, if I'm not wrong, is more just the tension, the discomfort around the subject. And so it's just, how do we unlock all of that? And I guess, yeah, this type of conversation does definitely help. And I guess all of this hopefully will inform actually regarding the procedures when creating this safe space, actually enable to hopefully find out where the problems, and after that to be able to find the procedures that we could put in place, or how we could implement those changes. So slowly but surely, at a slow pace. Alison say, even like this make a big difference. And then somebody say, much appreciating Naveena for coordinating and leading the session. Well, I think we could, we are 11:53. I guess we could wrap up the session.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Naveena for that really interesting talk, and thanks to Hugh for doing the introduction at the beginning, and of course, massive thanks to Yumna for being a driving force behind the BAME Society. It's really important for us in engineering to get to grips with all of this. We're co-sponsoring some masters projects which are advertised. I'm not sure if they've been filled, I'll check, but research masters to try and get some data behind this, because as engineers we're all data driven and numbers driven. So I mean that was one of the things that helped me understand the scale of the problems here when Yumna came to me with all the stats and figures, and it is just undeniable that there's a problem. So those two research projects, one funded by the M2A, one funded by the College of Engineering, will start hopefully next year, as long as we're all back in work after the pandemic, and shed some light and get some important data, quantitative and qualitative data on the experiences of people particularly in Swansea. Yeah, a big thanks to the College of Engineering for funding that as well. I think that's it for this talk. If Yumna wants to say anything finally to wrap up, but otherwise that's the end of this talk, and we look forward to the next talk in this session. As I say, we've already had 2. This is the 3rd, so we want to keep up momentum and try and do something in a few months' time, probably. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you, Naveena, for your time. I know this was really busy month for you with the exams and the student. Thank you for taking the time to put this together, and thank you to the college and Dave and M2A for being such great allies. So yeah, somebody asked when would the slide be sent, so that's something we could send you the slides this afternoon or something like that, so depending on Naveena's availability. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say, and I guess, thank you to the attendees for tuning in, and for being so interactive via the chat, and just getting our brains to kind of just think slightly more about how we could actually create more inclusive spaces. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Questions, and send the slides right away to you.
Okay, lovely, thank you.
Thank you.